All right, everyone, welcome back to World Civilization Since 1500. My name is Josh Haynes, and today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression of the 1930s. I'm going to argue today that far and away, the most influential changes in the decades following World War I lay in the Great Depression of the 1930s. In 1929, events in the United States triggered this global economic crisis, and the Depression lasted throughout the 1930s. This Great Depression represented the ultimate failure of liberalism, the dream that rational humans could solve any problem, create perpetual progress, and ultimately perfect society. All that by simply protecting individual liberty and free trade. Now, if the horror of World War I revealed the failure of political liberalism, then the Great Depression revealed the failure of economic liberalism, right? That is, of free market capitalism. People turned away from liberalism. They realized that individual liberty and a free market simply could not stop a global economic calamity. The problem was too great. So instead, people everywhere demanded active government solutions to the massive economic problem. We're going to see that over and over. People demanding active government solutions to the massive global problem of the Great Depression. So our major questions for today will be these. In what ways does the Great Depression represent the ultimate failure of liberalism? What exactly caused the Great Depression? This is a really complex question that has bedeviled historians for generations. What exactly caused it? How did it impact common people? Your discussion for this week is specifically designed to help you get at that question. How does it affect common people? And finally, how did people attempt to solve the problem? We'll see several examples of that. So those are our major questions. Now, after World War I, the nations of Europe hammered out the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This peace deal, I argue, represents the failure of liberalism. For last week, you read Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, and I argued that Woodrow Wilson outlined the liberal dream in the 14 points. He wants every country to have self-determination, and he wants everybody to trade freely. This is the great liberal dream. But France focused on punishing Germany. Most importantly for our work today, I laid out several elements of the peace treaty in my previous lecture, but most importantly for our work today, Germany had to pay $33 million in reparations to the victorious countries and to repay them for the losses they had suffered. Germany also endured a series of other economic penalties that really hampered its economic recovery. So just as one example, Germany had to surrender to give up all its merchant vessels larger than 1,600 tons. And Germany had to deliver coal for free to Belgium, France, and Italy for the next 10 years. These kinds of economic penalties, the war reparations and this series of other economic penalties, hampered Germany's economic recovery and ultimately left Germany bankrupt by the late 1920s. Now, contrast that with the situation in the United States. In the United States, things looked very, very different in the 1920s. Now, of course, as I tell this part of the story, you're going to see a lot of parallels with our current economic situation. And I'll point a couple of them out to you as we go. In the United States in the 1920s, people enjoyed a new era of prosperity. Throughout the 1920s, economic inequality increased, but the basic standard of living also increased. So this is one of the very few times when a rising economic tide lifts all boats, so to speak. Inequality grows, but so does the basic standard of living. How? New technologies became available in the 1920s. And American firms built factories that churned out all manner of products that transformed daily life. So Americans in the 1920s enjoyed this moment of high employment, mass production, all driven by mass consumerism. High employment, mass production, driven by mass consumerism. Everybody wants the hot new gadgets, right? Everybody's wish list includes radios, especially, like the one pictured here, but also phonographs, telephones, and electric appliances of every kind. Vacuum cleaners, but also washing machines and refrigerators. And of course, there were automobiles and swimsuits. Often I do a bit on how this consumerism changes American culture. A whole new entertainment culture emerges, but we don't have time for that today. So, lots of new gadgets, radios, but especially cars. Automaker Henry Ford used a new assembly line process to make cheap cars. And lots of American manufacturers adopted this assembly line mode of production. Greater efficiency allowed Ford to sell his cars so cheaply that even the people who worked in his factories could afford them. However, to be clear, a job at a Ford factory was something else. Very few other jobs offered wages quite that high. So, big picture. American prosperity in the 1920s is driven by high employment and mass production underpinned by mass consumerism. However, in a sense, American prosperity in the 1920s was an illusion. It concealed very real instability. Gross economic inequality was growing. As your textbook notes, by 1928, the top 1% of the U.S. population controlled 24% of the nation's wealth. And a grossly unequal society is an inherently unstable society. This is one of those parallels with our situation today that is suggested. By comparison, today, inequality is much worse. The wealthiest 1% of Americans today control 38% of the nation's wealth. as opposed to 24% in 1928. Make of that what you will. Now, the twin problems of low wages and easy credit made the inequality problem worse in the 1920s. Low wages and easy credit. The grossly unequal distribution of wealth meant that lots of Americans could not afford the products they made at their own factory jobs. Yet the advertising industry insisted Americans could afford consumer products. And consume they did, often on credit, borrowed money. Worse still, Americans began using easy credit, borrowed money, to fuel risky, speculative investments. Speculation. Speculation was a poison, and it helped to kill the stock market. So what does speculation look like? Americans bought stocks, that is, shares in firms. But they bought on the margin. That's the phrase people use. They bought on the margin. Buying on the margin was a common method of financing investment in stocks. So, for example, let's say you want to buy a share of stock in the hot new technology company, RCA, the Radio Corporation of America. But you can't quite afford to buy that stock in RCA. No problem. You can buy on the margin. Stockbrokers encourage regular people, average Joes, to buy stock with a 10% down payment. And the broker loaned buyers the remaining 90%. Okay, so far so good. Both parties expect the value of that stock to rise rapidly. Once it rises high enough, regular average Joe can sell his stock for a high enough price to pay off the loan from the broker and still make a tidy profit for himself. So buying on the margin is predicated, it relies on this idea that stocks will always go up and they'll do it real fast. It seemed like everyone was making money in the stock market buying on the margin. So more and more people did it. They were afraid of missing out on the good times. And all that just pumped stock prices higher and higher and higher. By the way, speaking of investing in the hot new technology company's stock, I noticed that the music streaming service Spotify went public today, so you can go out and buy a stock yourself right now. At the opening bell, it was selling for $132 a share. We'll see where it goes. In the 1920s, just as today, what goes up must eventually come down. And in October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. Fears that stocks were overpriced led many investors to begin selling. And then everyone started selling, all at once. Stock prices plummeted, and the fragile international financial system collapsed like a house of cards. As the stock market crashed, consumer spending dried up. all those people who had fueled the economic growth of the 1920s by buying cars and radios and all kinds of other gadgets, suddenly they stopped spending. In response, factories cut production. They laid off workers. Unemployment skyrocketed. And that just drove consumer spending even lower. Then the banks start to collapse. U.S. banks had loaned recklessly to Americans as well as to foreign governments and foreign companies. As Americans watched their speculative investments in the stock market evaporate, they stopped paying the loans they had taken from U.S. banks. People who had savings in those banks start withdrawing all the money they can to pay their own debts. Well, banks had already lent that money to other people, and now they can't collect. So banks failed. They collapsed. And lots of regular Joe depositors lost their life savings through no fault of their own. So things are not good in the United States. They went from good to bad real quick. But how does the contagion spread to the rest of the world? How does the contagion spread to the rest of the world? Throughout the 1920s, the United States had been the world's banker. For example, Germany borrowed heavily from U.S. banks to make their crippling reparations payments to France. France used that money to pay its own loans to American banks. Well, after the crash of 1929, American banks called in their loans from France and Germany. But Germany's economy had not yet recovered. Germany had actually stopped paying its reparations. They certainly couldn't pay back the loans they had gotten from American banks. Well, if Germany is not paying its reparations to France, that means France can't pay its loans from American banks. So the contagion spread to Europe. United States policy helped to spread the contagion further through tariffs. In 1930, the U.S. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff in response to the growing economic crisis. The Smoot-Hawley tariff led directly to a decline of world trade and global economic devastation. I'm going to say that again. The Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 led directly to a decline of world trade and global economic devastation. I repeated that because there's been a lot of talk in the news about tariffs lately. This is one historical example of why people dislike tariffs in general. This is a historical example of why people are terrified that our current tariffs are going to lead to a trade war. Congress intended for the Smoot-Hawley tariff to protect American firms from foreign competition. That's the goal. America first. Protect American firms from foreign competition. So, the tariff places huge taxes on goods imported from foreign countries. This makes those goods artificially expensive. Congress hopes consumers will buy American goods instead of these artificially expensive foreign goods, right? America first. Now, as Congress debated the Smoot-Hawley tariff, 1,000 American economists signed a petition, or a letter, I should say, that they then sent to Congress, warning them that this proposed Smoot-Hawley tariff would ruin the global economy. Congress ignored that good advice. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and foreign imports soon became so expensive that American consumers stopped buying them. So, for example, Americans stopped buying coffee and sugar from Brazil. Well, Brazil's economy depended on selling coffee and sugar to American consumers. So the loss of American customers caused an economic crisis in Brazil. Similar situations occurred all over the world. We'll come back to Brazil a little bit later. So how do countries around the world respond? They respond with tariffs of their own, starting a trade war just as economists had feared. Historians sometimes call this trend economic nationalism. Right? Nations put their own economies first to protect them. Economic nationalism. Yet the overall result of the Smoot-Hawley tariff is clear. Economic nationalism in the 1930s contributed directly to a rapid decline in world trade and global economic devastation. By 1932, you don't necessarily need these stats in your notes, but I just want to give you a sense of how bad things are getting by 1932. By 1932, worldwide industrial output had dropped 38%. International trade dropped by 62%. Unemployment rates in industrialized countries, Europe and the United States, unemployment rates in industrialized countries ranged from 20 all the way up to 33%. Now, let me put that number in perspective for you. Right? 20%, 33%, is that a lot or a little? During the worst of the Republican recession in 2008 and 2009, unemployment rates in the United States hit 10%. And at the time, we considered it a horrible disaster. It's taken many people a full decade to recover, and some people still haven't recovered. Compare that to 1932. In the United States in 1932, the unemployment rate was 25%. Right, we think 10% is a disaster. Try 25%. So, how does this global economic devastation impact common people? Thousands of Americans became homeless. Able-bodied people who wanted to work found themselves waiting in lines for rations of bread and soup. People sold apples and pencils on street corners and in subways, doing the free market hustle for pennies. It got so bad that some committed suicide. Men abandoned their families to become hobos. Single mothers faced starvation as they tried desperately to provide for their children. You'll see examples of the Depression's impact on common people in the material that accompanies your discussion exercise this week. So, big picture. From 1929 to 1932, from 1929 to 1932, things went from bad to much worse, as the world, much of the world, was engulfed by the Great Depression. And everywhere, liberal industrial capitalism and constitutional republics did nothing. Liberalism failed. So people started demanding government solutions, active government solutions, to this massive global economic crisis. The United States is an excellent example of both of those trends, right? The failure of liberal free market principles and demands for active government intervention. So let me walk you through those. When the economic crisis began in 1929, this guy was president. U.S. President Herbert Hoover was a staunch believer in free markets. So he refused to support government intervention in the economic crisis. Hoover simply promised Americans that the magical free market would soon correct itself. Really soon. Soon it's going to happen. The magical free market is going to fix itself. He said this for nearly 4 years, and nothing happened. So, shouldn't surprise anyone that in 1932, Herbert Hoover lost his bid for re-election. Instead, Americans elected a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, better known simply as FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, better known as FDR. Now, FDR promised what he called a New Deal for American people. A New Deal. Nobody really knew what that meant. But FDR and his allies in Congress used the ideas of British economist John Maynard Keynes to save American capitalism. FDR and his allies in Congress used the ideas of the British economist John Maynard Keynes to save American capitalism. So who is this John Maynard Keynes? What are his ideas? Why do we all live by Keynesian economic principles even today? John Maynard Keynes argued that government action, and especially government spending, could moderate the recessions and the depressions that were common in unregulated capitalist economies. Government action, and especially government spending, can moderate the recessions and the depressions that are common in unregulated capitalist economies. FDR and his allies really take this idea to heart. Over time, FDR's successes led to a new economic consensus. Liberalism was wrong. Free markets could not self-correct. John Maynard Keynes was right. People must use the power of government to shape economies. That is, FDR accepted the basic principle that government spending could flatten out the boom-bust cycle of capitalism, make it safer for regular Joes, but still profitable for the ultra-rich fat cats. So FDR and Keynesian economics saved American capitalism. Now, if you take upper division U.S. history courses during your time at USM, you'll take a really deep dive into New Deal policies to show just exactly how Keynesian economic principles were applied in the U.S. We don't have time for that, so I'm going to keep it simple with just a couple of examples. So, here's your two examples of Keynesian economic principles in action in the United States. At FDR's urging, Congress created several New Deal government programs. For example, Congress created a huge public works program called the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. WPA, or Works Progress Administration. The WPA created thousands of government-funded jobs. WPA workers built all kinds of stuff: schools, highways, bridges, parks, and public buildings, including the post office in downtown Hattiesburg, which is actually a pretty great example of WPA architecture. So if you haven't seen the post office in downtown Hattiesburg, go take a look. Now, Congress and FDR also regulated banks to curb the speculation and the reckless lending that had made the financial system into a house of cards. In 1933, Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking. Okay, so what does that mean? Commercial banking is what happens when you go down to your neighborhood branch bank on Hardy Street and deposit money. Then the bank uses that money to loan out to other people. Investment banking is what happens when big Wall Street firms help other big firms sell stock in hopes of reaping huge profits. Right? Commercial banking versus investment banking. Lots of people blamed the whole Great Depression on the notion that commercial and investment banks were intertwined. So the Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking and investment banking. That will protect regular Joe depositors from the wolves of Wall Street. And it worked. It worked. Until 1999. In 1999, Republicans in Congress repealed the Glass-Steagall Act with the blessing of a Democratic president. And less than 10 years later, the American financial system collapsed. Now, oh wait, we're not there yet. Hang on. All right, I'll leave it. Now, one last thing on the United States, the Great Depression in the United States, before we move on to other parts of the world. To be clear, the New Deal did not end the Great Depression in the United States. However, it saved American capitalism by pumping just enough money into the economy to prevent chaos. ultimately, it took massive, unprecedented government spending on World War II to lift the United States out of the Great Depression. The greater impact of the New Deal really is creating that new consensus that Keynesian economic principles are correct. Interventionist government is fine. It really is okay to use the power of government, especially government spending, to at least try to remedy an economic crisis, such as the lesson of the Great Depression. Things went down differently in Europe. Things went down a little differently in Europe. Dr. Ross has already explained Russia's dictatorial socialism as one solution to the global economic calamity, the Great Depression. In Russia, in the 1930s, there was impressive economic growth, full employment. Though, as Dr. Ross explained, that came at terrible cost. But remember that Europe had a history with socialism going back to the 1840s. So when liberalism failed and the Great Depression began, Great Britain, France, and Northern European countries all experimented with democratic socialism rather than Russian-style dictatorial socialism. Democratically elected governments use their power to create greater equality, not just safeguard liberty. For example, Great Britain's Labour Party had socialist ideals and labor union roots. Twice in the 1920s, Great Britain elected a socialist prime minister. In the 1930s, the Labour Party created a broad coalition with non-socialists, and together, ironically perhaps, together, they enacted tariffs. That is, they practiced their version of economic nationalism. They put Britain's economy first. But that only depressed trade further. So in 1937, a new prime minister came to power in Great Britain. He took a more active approach. He used the power of government spending, in this case, on military defense, to jumpstart Great Britain's economy. In Northern Europe, things went a little further. In Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, democratically elected socialist governments created what your textbook calls welfare states. That is, governments in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark provided education, healthcare, housing subsidies, and unemployment insurance, all paid for through high taxes. This kind of democratic socialism proved to be a viable alternative to Russian-style dictatorial socialism. Now, what about Europe's colonies? Right? How does the contagion spread there, and how does it affect common people? In Europe's colonies, people suffered under colonial governments that had little regard for their well-being. For example, Colonial Southeast Asia was the world's biggest rubber-producing region. Well, when automobile sales in the US and Europe plummeted by half, the demand for rubber also collapsed. The French colony of Indochina, or Vietnam, the French colony of Vietnam was a major rubber producer, and it got hit especially hard. In Great Britain's colony of Gold Coast, in present-day West Africa, farmers had staked their lives on the production of cocoa. But they too suffered badly when consumer demand for this luxury product collapsed. As your textbook points out, when Africans in British colonies could no longer pay the taxes demanded by the empire, young people stopped attending school to look for work, to help their families. Many Latin American countries also suffered from this global contagion, the Great Depression. We've already talked a little bit about Brazil, so I'm going to stick with that example for a little bit. Brazil was the world's largest coffee producer. So after the Smoot-Hawley tariff, they're really hurting. They lose the US market. So they're desperate to stabilize the price of coffee on the world market. Brazilian coffee planters destroyed enough of their coffee crop to supply the entire world for a year. Which seems crazy, right? They destroyed enough of their coffee crop to supply the world for a year. How could that possibly be good economics? Well, production had outstripped market demand. And that overproduction, that glut of product on the market, had driven prices so low that it actually cost more money to produce a ton of coffee than you could sell it for. So, Brazilian planters got rid of the surplus by destroying the crop. And they're hoping that that's going to drive prices back up. But it didn't. The strategy failed. So agricultural workers began leaving the big coffee plantations. They crowded into urban shanty towns called favelas. Now, it was a common trend in Latin American countries that when leaders failed to deal with the economic calamity, the result was often military takeover and a state-controlled economy. And that's the trend. Military takeover followed by a state-controlled economy. Think of it as the Latin American version of economic nationalism. And so it was in Brazil. A military coup occurred there in 1930 and established a dictatorship. The military dictator, the new military dictator in Brazil, established state-run factories and controlled both workers' unions and nominally private firms. But the real problem in Brazil was that workers on rural coffee plantations and favelas remained desperately poor. And the dictator's reforms, or the state-controlled economy, did nothing to help them. So, what caused the global Great Depression ultimately? The many failures of political and economic liberalism had made the international financial system into a house of cards. In the United States, reckless, unethical practices in the financial industry, rampant consumerism, and gross inequality created a veneer of prosperity that covered real instability. And when the veneer cracked, the contagion quickly spread from the United States to Europe, to Asia, to Africa, to Latin America, aided along its way by the Smoot-Hawley tariff, this bad policy that diminished global trade. How did the Great Depression impact common people? Unemployment, lost savings, poverty, hunger, desperation. Your discussion and exercise for the week, I think, makes all that clear through the power of brilliant photography. How did people attempt to solve the problem of the Great Depression? Virtually everywhere, with varying degrees of intensity and success, people turned away from liberalism. They sought more active government intervention in the economy. People everywhere began to realize the free market simply could not heal itself. They needed to take action. Now, Dr. Ross will pick up the story there next time when we look further at the sometimes reactionary ways that people deal with the Great Depression. So we'll see you then.